Roy was not the kind of man people noticed. He was medium height, medium build, with hands that were rough from work and a face that did not give much away. He had been at the Aldrin Frontier Outpost for 3 weeks, and in that time he had learned where everything was kept, who to avoid in the mornings, and which floorboard near the kitchen creaked the loudest at night. He did his job, kept his head down, and asked for very little. That was how Roy had always lived, and it had served him well enough. The outpost itself sat at the edge of a wide stretch of open land where the hills rolled into forest and the forest rolled into mountains. It was not a pretty place. The buildings were old wood and dry mud, the kind that had been patched so many times the patches had patches. There were about 40 people living and working there. Traders, guards, farmers, and supply workers like Roy. Most of them were decent enough. A few were difficult. All of them were tired in the quiet way that people get when they have been living hard for too long. The storm came on a Tuesday. It rolled in from the mountains fast and mean, the kind of storm that does not give much warning. The wind hit first, then the rain, then something else entirely. A sound like a great crack of breaking wood, but larger. Much larger. Coming from somewhere up on the ridge above the outpost. By morning the storm had passed and the sky was a pale, washed-out gray. Roy was carrying a crate of dried grain from the storage shed when he heard the shouting from the east gate. He set the crate down and looked. 4 men were hauling a flatbed wagon through the gate with ropes and a great deal of effort. On the wagon was the largest living thing Roy had ever seen up close. A dragon. She was dark green, nearly black along the edges of her scales, and she was completely unconscious. Her left side was badly damaged, the scales cracked and dark with dried blood where the storm had clearly thrown her hard against something solid. One of her wings was folded at a wrong angle. Her breathing was slow and deep, each breath moving her whole enormous body. Roy stood and watched with everyone else as the men hauled the wagon into the wide barn at the far end of the outpost. Nobody spoke much. People just stared with wide eyes and stepped back to give the wagon room. The outpost doctor, a thin older man named Finn, went in after them. He came out 20 minutes later looking pale but steady. "She will live," Finn said to no one in particular. "Probably." The outpost commander, a lean woman named Sarah, stood with her arms crossed and her jaw tight. She did not look pleased about any of it. She gave orders quickly and quietly. The dragon mother was to be kept in the back room of the barn. The barn was to be locked. Nobody was to go inside without her permission. Then Earl found the hatchling. Earl was one of the older guards, a stout man with a gray beard and the permanent expression of someone expecting bad news. He had gone into the barn to help get the mother settled and had opened the wrong door by mistake. He came back out faster than Roy had ever seen a man his size move. "There is a pup in the side room," Earl said, breathing hard. "Small. Gold scales. Mean looking." Sarah put 2 guards on the barn door immediately. Word spread through the outpost fast the way all bad news does. A dragon mother, unconscious and injured, locked in the barn. And her hatchling, alone in the side room, small and frightened and apparently very unfriendly. People moved their daily routines away from that end of the outpost without being told to. Earl found Roy that afternoon while Roy was back to moving crates. "You stay away from that barn," Earl said, pointing a thick finger at him. "Both rooms. You understand me?" Roy nodded and asked if the pup had been fed anything. Earl looked at him the way people sometimes looked at Roy when he said something that did not fit the conversation. "It is a dragon pup," Earl said slowly, as if Roy might have forgotten this important detail. "You do not feed it. You do not go near it. You do not think about it more than you have to." Roy said he understood. Earl gave him one more long look and walked away. The rest of the day passed normally. Roy finished his crate count, ate a quiet dinner in the corner of the common hall, and went to his bunk when the lamps were turned low. Around him the outpost settled into night sounds. Wind against the walls. Horses shifting in the stable. Someone coughing 2 bunks over. Roy closed his eyes. He was almost asleep when he heard it. It came from the direction of the barn, thin and small and carried on the wind through the gap under the bunkhouse door. A sound that did not fit the night around it. Not a roar. Not a hiss. Not anything fierce or dangerous. Just a small, miserable crying. High and tired and very alone. The kind of sound that had no anger in it at all. Only exhaustion and fear and the simple need for something warm to be nearby. Roy lay still and listened. The crying went on for a long time. He stared at the dark ceiling and thought about Earl's words. He thought about Sarah's orders and the 2 guards on the barn door and the very reasonable list of reasons why a plain supply worker should stay in his bunk and mind his own business. Then he sat up. He reached down and pulled on his boots. He stood quietly so as not to wake anyone, picked up his jacket from the hook by the wall, and moved toward the door. He was not sure exactly what he was going to do. He only knew he could not keep lying there listening. The barn door was guarded by two men, but neither of them was Earl. Roy recognized them both. Ned was young, maybe 19, and had the look of someone who had only recently been given responsibility and was not entirely sure what to do with it. The other was a quiet man named Walt, older, who spent most of his free time sharpening things that did not need sharpening. They were sitting on upturned crates on either side of the barn door with a small lantern between them. Roy walked up holding a bowl of warm broth in one hand and a strip of dried meat in the other. He had heated the broth on the kitchen stove while the cook was not looking, moving quietly and quickly the way he did most things. Ned stood up straight when he saw Roy coming. Walt just watched. "Commander said nobody goes in," Ned said. Roy stopped in front of them. He looked at the bowl, then at the door, then at Ned. "The pup has not eaten in over a day," he said simply. Ned opened his mouth and closed it again. He looked at Walt. Walt looked at Roy for a long moment. Then he looked at the bowl. Then he looked somewhere past Roy's shoulder at nothing in particular. "I did not see anything," Walt said quietly and went back to his crate. Ned hesitated. Then he stepped aside. Roy lifted the latch and went in. The barn smelled of old wood and hay and something deeper underneath, a dry, smoky warmth that had not been there before the Dragon Mother arrived. The main room was dim. Roy kept his candle low and moved to the side door without looking toward the back room where Sarah lay. He could hear her breathing from there, slow and enormous, like distant thunder that never quite arrived. He pushed the side door open with his shoulder and stepped in. The hatchling was in the far corner exactly where Earl had said it was. In the candlelight it looked smaller than Roy had expected. It was curled tight against the wall with its wings pressed flat and its tail wrapped around its own body. The gold scales had gone pale and dull the way metal does in cold air. Its eyes opened the moment the light touched them and locked onto Roy with an intensity that was startling in something so small. Then it hissed. It was not a large sound, but it was a serious one. The hatchling pulled itself upright and spread its small wings just enough to look bigger than it was. Its lip pulled back, showing teeth that were very white and very sharp. Every part of it said the same thing clearly. "Do not come closer." Roy did not come closer. He lowered himself to the floor right where he was standing, just inside the doorway, moving slowly and without any sharp angles to his motion. He sat down cross-legged and set the bowl of broth on the floor in front of him. He placed the dried meat beside it. Then he rested his hands on his knees and looked at the wall just to the left of the hatchling so he was not staring directly at it. The hatchling kept its wings up for a while. Roy waited. He was good at waiting. It was something people did not often notice about him, but Roy had a deep and genuine patience that had nothing forced in it. He did not tap his fingers or shift his weight or sigh. He just sat and let the minutes go by and breathed slowly and let the room be what it was. The candle flame leaned in the draft from under the door. After a while the hatchling lowered its wings. Not all the way. Just enough. It kept its eyes on Roy with that same sharp focus, but the rigid, ready tension in its small body softened very slightly. It was still afraid. But it was thinking now instead of just reacting. Roy did not move. The hatchling's nose lifted. It turned its head a fraction toward the bowl. Roy watched this from the corner of his eye without turning his head. The broth was still warm enough to carry a smell into the cold air of the room, and the hatchling had clearly caught it. Another few minutes passed. Then the hatchling took one step forward. It stopped immediately and looked at Roy. Roy did nothing. The hatchling took another step. Stopped again. Roy stayed exactly as he was, hands on knees, eyes on the wall, breathing steady. It took the better part of half an hour, but the hatchling crossed the room one careful step at a time until it reached the dried meat. It snatched the meat up fast, jumped back 2 steps, and ate it in quick tearing bites without taking its eyes off Roy. When the meat was gone it looked at the bowl. It came forward again, faster this time, and drank the broth in noisy gulps that steamed in the cold air. Then it retreated to its corner and watched Roy. Roy picked up the empty bowl. He stood slowly. He walked to the door, lifted the latch, and left. He did not make a fuss of it. He did not look back over his shoulder or say anything to the hatchling or to Walt and Ned on the other side of the door. He just walked back through the dark outpost to the kitchen, rinsed the bowl, and went to his bunk. In the morning he was back. He brought the same thing. Warm broth, dried meat, a candle. He sat in the same spot on the floor in the same way. The hatchling hissed at him again, shorter this time. Then it crossed the room and ate. Roy came back the morning after that too. On the third morning the hatchling did not hiss at all. A week passed and the side room stopped feeling like a dangerous place. It still looked the same. Cold floor, rough walls, a small high window that let in a thin strip of gray morning light. Nothing had been done to make it better. Nobody had been asked to clean it or bring in fresh hay or do anything at all to make it more suitable for a dragon pup that had been left alone in it by accident and circumstance. Roy had not asked for any of that either. He just kept coming with his bowl and his candle and his patient way of sitting still. But things had changed quietly, the way things do when nobody is making a fuss. The hatchling now moved to the center of the room when it heard Roy's footsteps in the hall. Not to the door. Not rushing forward in any obvious way. Just shifting from the corner to the middle, which was its own kind of statement. Roy had learned the difference early. The corner meant leave me alone. The middle meant I am willing to see what you have brought today. Roy had started talking. Not much. Not in any important way. Just small, quiet words while he sat on the floor and the hatchling ate. He talked about the weather and about which crates he had moved that morning and about a horse named Barley who lived in the stable and had a habit of pulling Roy's jacket sleeve whenever he walked past. Small things. Nothing that required a response. He was not talking to get anything back. He just thought that silence had been the only thing in the room for too long, and that a voice, even a plain one saying nothing much, was better than nothing. The hatchling listened. Roy could tell because its ears, small and slightly ridged at the tip, would shift forward when he spoke. He had named it Pip on the 4th day. He had not planned to. It had happened the way small things often happen, without a decision being made. He had been sitting on the floor watching the hatchling drink from the bowl and had thought, quietly in his own head, that it was about the size of a young dog and moved with that same kind of cautious, testing energy that young things have when they are figuring out the world. And the name Pip had simply arrived and stayed. He did not say it out loud for 2 more days. When he finally did, just once, quietly, the hatchling had lifted its head from the bowl and looked at him with those deep amber eyes and held the look for a moment before going back to eating. Roy took that as good enough. Grant from the grain store had stopped pretending not to watch. He would lean against the doorframe of his building in the mornings when Roy walked past with his bowl and give a slow nod, the kind that said he had opinions but had decided to keep them to himself for now. Lena the cook had started leaving a small pile of meat scraps on the kitchen counter every evening without comment. Roy took them without comment. It worked well for everyone. Earl watched all of this with the expression of a man watching someone walk slowly toward a hole in the ground and being unable to decide whether to warn them again or just wait and see. On the 9th evening Roy arrived at the barn and knew immediately that something was wrong. Pip was in the corner. Not the middle. The corner. Curled tight with the wings pressed flat and the tail wrapped close. The same position Roy had found him in on the very first night. Roy set the bowl down and crouched forward slowly. He could hear Pip's breathing from the doorway. It was too fast. Shallow and quick in a way that did not sound right. Roy moved closer than he usually did. Pip did not hiss or pull back. That alone told Roy more than anything else. Pip always had something to say about personal space. The fact that he said nothing now meant he did not have the energy for it. Roy reached out and pressed the back of his hand gently against Pip's side. The heat came through immediately. Not the normal dry warmth of scales in a closed room. This was a deep, radiating fever heat, the kind that meant the body was working very hard against something. Pip shivered under Roy's hand even though the room was not especially cold. Roy stood up and left the room quickly. He went to the outpost supply room and stood in front of the medical shelf reading labels by lamplight. He was not a doctor. He knew that. But he had grown up on a working farm where animals got sick regularly and the doctor was 2 hours away on a good road, which meant you learned to read a label carefully and use your best judgment and hope. He found a fever powder made for large animals, read every word on the packaging twice, and measured out a small careful amount that he thought was reasonable for something Pip's size. He was not certain. He did his best. He mixed the powder into fresh warm broth and carried it back to the side room along with his own wool blanket from his bunk, the thick one he used on cold nights that he had owned for 4 years and valued more than most things he owned. Pip drank the broth slowly. Not with appetite. Just with the dull, tired compliance of something that was too worn down to resist. Roy spread the blanket over Pip as carefully as he could, tucking the edges around the small curled body. Pip did not move away. He just watched Roy with half-open eyes that were glassy and dim. Roy sat down against the wall. He had no plan beyond staying. That was the whole of it. He pulled his jacket tight and leaned his head back against the rough wood and listened to Pip breathe. Every hour he checked the heat along Pip's side. Every hour he spoke a few quiet words, nothing in particular, just sound and presence in the dark. Sometime before dawn the shaking slowed. By the time gray light came through the high window Pip's breathing had deepened and steadied into something that sounded closer to sleep than struggle. Roy pressed his hand to Pip's side once more. Still warm but different. The fierce, working heat was easing. Roy let out a long slow breath and closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, Pip was looking at him. Tired still but clear. The amber eyes were focused and present in a way they had not been the night before. Pip made a very small sound, low and brief, nothing Roy had heard from him before. Roy did not know what it meant. But it did not sound like fear. He nodded once and got up to fetch a fresh bowl. The 14th morning began like all the others. Roy was up before most of the outpost, moving through the quiet gray light with his jacket on and his boots tied and his mind already on the kitchen and the broth and the meat scraps Lena would have left on the counter. He had a routine now and routine suited him. He liked knowing what the next hour looked like. It made the uncertain parts of life feel more manageable. He had just lifted the pot onto the stove when the sound came. It was not loud in the way that thunder is loud or the way a crowd is loud. It was loud in a different way entirely. It came up through the floor and through the walls and through the wood of the counter Roy's hands were resting on. It moved through everything solid and settled in the chest like a second heartbeat. Deep and resonant and enormous. The sound of something very large that had been still for a long time and was now awake. Then the voice. 2 words only. Common tongue, rough and slow like a language being lifted out of a long sleep. My child. Roy set the pot down carefully. He stood still for one moment. Then he walked out of the kitchen. The outpost had already come apart. People were outside their doors in various states of dress, looking toward the barn with wide eyes and very little color in their faces. Someone had knocked over a water bucket and nobody had stopped to pick it up. The 2 horses tied near the stable were pulling hard at their ropes and showing the whites of their eyes. A dog that belonged to one of the traders was flat on the ground with its nose between its paws and was not moving. Sarah was already at the barn door. She was dressed fully, which meant she had either been up early or had not slept. Roy suspected the second. She had 4 armed men with her, all of them standing with that particular stillness that people have when they are frightened and are working hard not to show it. Sarah herself looked controlled and tight, her jaw set and her eyes on the barn door. From inside came the sound again. Lower this time. A slow, rolling rumble that had no words in it but needed none. It was the sound of a mother who had woken up and found something missing and was becoming less patient about it with every passing second. The barn door creaked on its own from the vibration. None of Sarah's men moved toward it. Roy walked through the group without hurrying. He was not pushing past anyone. He just moved in the direct, unhurried way he moved through the supply room when he had a job to do and the job needed doing. People stepped aside without quite deciding to. Sarah turned when she heard him behind her. "Roy," she said with a warning in it. Roy stopped and looked at her. He was aware of how he must appear. Plain jacket, worn boots, no weapon, carrying nothing except the habits of the last 14 days. Not a soldier. Not anyone with authority or training or any particular standing in the outpost. Just a supply worker who had been sitting on a cold floor every night with a sick dragon pup. "I know Pip," he said. "And Pip knows me. Let me bring him to her." Sarah stared at him. Another sound came from inside the barn, longer this time, and the ground under their feet gave a faint shudder as Sarah shifted her weight against the walls. Dust fell from the eaves of the barn roof in a pale curtain. One of the armed men took a step back without appearing to notice he had done it. Sarah looked at her men. She looked at the barn door. She looked at Roy. He could see her thinking, working through it quickly the way she worked through everything, cost and risk and the very short list of options available to her in this particular moment. She stepped aside. Roy went in. The barn was different with Sarah awake. The air had changed. It was warmer and charged in a way that was hard to name, the way the air feels before a storm but closer and more immediate. The smoky dry warmth Roy had noticed on the first night was stronger now, filling the whole space from floor to rafters. He went to the side room first. Pip was standing. That was the first thing Roy noticed. Pip was on his feet in the center of the room, not the corner and not the doorway, the very center, with his head up and his ears forward and every part of him pointed toward the wall that separated his room from the back room where Sarah was. He was trembling very slightly, but Roy did not think it was fear. It was something else. Recognition maybe. Or need. Pip turned when Roy came in and looked at him with those amber eyes. Roy crossed the room and crouched down in front of Pip. He opened his arms the way he had started doing a few days ago when Pip had first allowed it. Pip stepped forward without hesitation and Roy lifted him carefully, settling the small warm weight against his chest with one arm underneath and one hand along Pip's side. Pip pressed his nose briefly against Roy's jaw. Then he turned his head toward the wall again. Roy stood up and walked back into the main barn and down the short hall to the back room door. He could feel Sarah on the other side of it. Not just the sound and the warmth but something larger, a presence that pressed against the door from the other side like weather. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and walked in. Sarah did not speak right away. She took her time with Pip first, and Roy understood that. He stayed on one knee and watched her work through it the way a mother does when she has been terrified for a long time and is only now beginning to believe the terrifying part is over. She turned Pip with her nose, checking each side of him carefully. She ran her jaw slowly along his back the way cats do with small things they are fond of. She breathed warm air over his wings and checked each one by lifting it gently with the tip of her nose and letting it fall back. She examined his legs and his tail and the pale gold scales along his belly. Pip bore all of this with the slightly impatient energy of a young thing that wants to be fussed over and also wants everyone to know that being fussed over is beneath it. He made small grumbling sounds and tried to wander off twice and was guided back both times by Sarah's nose without any fuss. Roy watched all of it and felt something loosen in his chest that he had not known was tight. Pip was well. The fever was gone. The dull, glassy look in his eyes from 9 nights ago was completely gone, and in its place was the bright, quick attention that Roy had come to know, the look that meant Pip was watching everything and thinking about most of it and would probably do something unpredictable in the next few minutes. When Sarah was satisfied, she lifted her head and looked at Roy. He had not moved. He was still on one knee, still quiet, hands still open at his sides. He had been in that position long enough that his knee was beginning to ache against the hard floor, but he did not shift or adjust himself. It did not seem like the right moment for that. Sarah studied him for a long time. Roy let her. He understood, in a plain and practical way, that being looked at carefully by something this large and this old was a reasonable thing to simply allow. She was not threatening him. She was reading him, the way you read ground before you walk on it, checking what it is made of and whether it will hold. Her eyes moved over his face. His hands. His jacket with the frayed left cuff that he had been meaning to fix for 2 months. His boots that had been resoled once already and would need it again before winter. Everything about him that said ordinary, working, plain. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than it had been through the walls. Still deep, still resonant, still something Roy felt as much as heard. But measured now. Careful. You fed him, she said. Yes, Roy said. Every day. Every day. She was quiet for a moment. Pip had settled against her front leg and was watching Roy with bright eyes, tail moving in a slow, contented sweep across the floor. He was sick, Sarah said. It was not quite a question. About a week ago, Roy said. Fever. I sat with him through it. He came right by morning. Sarah looked at him steadily. You sat through the night. Yes. Alone. Yes. Another silence. Outside, Roy could hear the wind picking up along the eaves. The ordinary sounds of the outpost going carefully about its business. Everyone staying well back and speaking in low voices and pretending very hard to be busy with something else. They told you not to come near him, Sarah said. Roy nodded. First day. The guard was pretty clear about it. But you came anyway. Yes. Sarah tilted her great head slightly. It was a small movement, but on something her size it shifted the whole balance of the room. Her gold eyes had not left his face. Roy had the feeling she was not just hearing his answers but checking them against something deeper, the way you hold a piece of wood to the light to see if there are cracks in it. Why? She asked. It was a simple word. One syllable. But Roy understood the full weight of it. She was not asking for a speech or an explanation or anything elaborate. She was asking the real question underneath all the other questions. Why did a man with no reason and no reward choose to walk into a dark room towards something frightened and alone? Roy thought about it for a moment. Not long. The answer was not complicated. It had not been complicated on the night he put his boots on and walked out of the bunkhouse either. It was just the truth of it, plain and without decoration. He shrugged once, a small honest movement. I heard him crying, Roy said. I could not just walk away. The room was very quiet. Sarah did not respond immediately. She looked at Roy with those deep gold eyes, and whatever she was measuring him against, whatever standard she was holding him to, he seemed to meet it. Not because he had said something impressive. Because he had said something true, and the truth of it was simple enough that there was nothing hidden in it anywhere. Pip made a small sound against her leg and she touched him briefly with her nose without looking away from Roy. When she spoke again, her voice was lower. Not sad. Not soft exactly. Just very deliberate, the way someone speaks when the words they are saying carry more weight than ordinary words and they want each one to land properly. My kind remembers, she said. Roy waited. A kindness given freely, she continued. With no order behind it. No reward waiting at the end of it. No audience. She paused. That is the rarest kind. Most creatures never manage it even once. Roy did not say anything. He did not think she was finished. "We remember such things for 1,000 years, Sarah said. "Every generation. The name and the deed and the shape of the person who did it. It is written into us." She looked at him steadily. "Your name will be known among my kind long after this outpost is dust and the people in it are forgotten. Long after you yourself are gone." Roy looked at her. He was quiet for a moment. He did not know what to do with something that large. 1,000 years was not a thing his mind could hold properly. He was a man who thought in terms of days and seasons and the length of time it took to move a crate from one side of a room to the other. 1,000 years was outside the edges of anything he could picture. So he just nodded once, slowly, the way he nodded at most things that were larger than him. Then Sarah did something that stopped every thought in Roy's head completely. She lowered her head. All the way down. Slowly and with intention, the massive dark green head coming down until her brow rested against the floor of the room, directly in front of Roy's knee. It was not a collapse or a weakness. Every part of the movement was deliberate. It was a bow, given fully and without any hesitation, from something ancient and enormous to a plain man kneeling on a cold floor in a worn jacket. Roy stared at the top of her head for a moment. He could see the fine detail of her scales up close, the way they overlapped like old tiles, dark green at the center going almost black at the edges. He could feel the warmth coming off her even from where he knelt. He did not know the right response to being bowed to by a dragon. He suspected there was no chapter in any book he had ever read that covered it. So he did the only thing that felt honest. He bowed his head back. What? Brief and plain, the same small nod he gave to people he respected when words were not needed. Sarah raised her head. They looked at each other for one more quiet moment. Then Roy put his hand briefly on Pip's head, one light touch between the ears, and Pip pushed up into it for a second before turning back to his mother. Roy stood up. He picked nothing up because he had brought nothing in. He walked to the door and pushed it open with his shoulder. The morning light came in white and clean and the outpost was spread out before him, everyone carefully busy with something, nobody looking directly at the barn, all of them very aware of what was behind him in that room. Sarah was standing nearest. She looked at Roy when he came out. Her face asked the question she did not say out loud. Roy looked at her and gave a small nod. "Everything is fine." Sarah let out a long slow breath and looked at the sky. Roy put his hands in his jacket pockets and walked back toward the supply room. The morning was getting on and there were crates to count and stock to check and the ordinary shape of the day was waiting for him the way it always did. Behind him the barn was quiet and warm. Inside it, a mother and her pup were together again. That was enough.